Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Long-Distance Worklife, the show where we aim to help you do more than survive, but thrive in the crazy, evolving world of work. Our guest today, because it is a Marissa-less episode, but our guest today is somebody very familiar to most of you. You have heard his name, if not actually met him. That is our boss and my co-author, Kevin Eikenberry. And when the interview is over, I would really love you to stick around. I have an important announcement to make at the end of the show that I hope you will stick around for and heed. That being said, we are going to introduce the lovely and talented Kevin Eikenberry. He is the brains behind the Kevin Eikenberry Group. He is also my co-author on the 3 books in the Long-Distance Worklife series: Long Distance Leader, Long Distance Teammate, Long Distance Team, and now circling back again with the updated version of Long Distance Leader. But he's not here to talk about any of that stuff. He is here to talk about his latest book, Flexible Leadership. Kevin, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. I'm glad to be here. It's nice to be on the other side of the mic.
Yeah, it is. You do as much of this or more than I do, and it's sometimes tiring, but I know you are energized because you've got a new book that you're very excited about. Let's start with the title, Flexible Leadership. I mean, isn't that the idea? What is the central idea?
Yeah, that's pretty close to the central idea. I think that most of us would say, well, if the world has changed, which obviously you've talked about a lot in the show, then shouldn't we have to change as a leader too? And I would say the answer is yes. And yet, for the most part, most leaders are locked into the way they've always done it, to what they think their style is, to what they think they're supposed to do, to what their habits are. And my assertion is that there's not a right way to lead. But in every situation, there's probably a best way or a small number of best ways that we could lead in that moment. And we need to figure out how to understand what those moments look like and how to lead in the best way, not necessarily in our most comfortable way.
Well, and that gets us to kind of an important point, which is there's this notion that, we're returning to the office or remote work is kind of behind us and we've done it and we've kind of moved on from that. First of all, I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, I think that what we've got is a pendulum, right? And we had a pandemic and the pendulum went all the way to the law said you had to stay home from work, from the office, to maybe we could make this work, to maybe we really think we ought to go back to the way it used to be. But, I remember you and I saying very early in the pandemic, and I think you probably actually said it first, that the cat's out of the bag, that, you're never going to put that back in. You were never going to go all the way back to where we were before. And even though now, as we have this conversation in January of 2025, where it seems like an awful lot of big organizations are saying, y'all need to come on back to the office, I don't think we'll ever go all the way back to where we once were. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's likely, and I don't even think it's necessary.
Well, and it does fall on leaders to navigate their way through this. I mean, you and I saw a report this morning that said while 80% of companies have back to the office orders, only 17% of them are actually enforcing the rules. Or what's even kind of worse is we've reverted to the stealth remote work that we had in the before times where, well, somebody's kid is sick, so we'll let her work from home. And, somebody else just, he gets his stuff done, so we'll just let him slide and let it go. And that lack of structure can put a lot of pressure on a leader.
Puts a lot of pressure on a leader, puts a lot of pressure on individuals, right? Am I in the in group that gets to stay home? Am I not? Like, how does that all play? There's a whole lot of stuff I think there. To me, this whole pendulum swing I was mentioning, Wayne, and of course you and I have talked about this, but to me, in Long Distance Leader, we talk about the 3O model, and that leadership is about outcomes, others, and ourselves. And I think so much of all of the tumult, so much of the conversation about what return to office looks like and where it's happening and what's going to happen with it has really been a tension between outcomes and others, right? So those who have said we need to come back to the office have said we need that so we can get the outcomes that we need. And it was like we're fighting against, in some ways, against others, the team, who in many cases would rather stay home. And it's been framed as there's going to be a winner and a loser. And maybe outputs are winning because we're going to have to come back. Or when we weren't bringing people back, it's like, well, we had to give in to others so we wouldn't lose them. And so it's been framed too often as an either or choice. And it's been framed as a tension between those two things. And in the new book, I would call that a flexor, the idea of a flexor. And the right answer in this case to this conversation we're having here is that, like with any of the flexors that we could talk about, that the right answer is rarely at either end, but it's somewhere in the middle, right? And so that's why I don't think we'll ever go all the way back, because we have, the cat is out of that bag, right? You can't put the genie back in that bottle, whatever you want to say. And the reality is that even though people might feel that tension, the leaders that are most effective, the leaders that are flexible, will say, what's the context say? And where should we be leaning between those two, rather than we're going all the way back or we're never going back. And I've never really been a proponent of either end of that spectrum, but the right answer is somewhere in the middle. And it's a different answer for different organizations and different teams, different work.
Yeah, let's talk about, because you mentioned the 3O model, and all of our work in the Long Distance Work-Life series contains models that are helpful. And we didn't invent all of those models. In Long Distance Leader, one of the most important things I think we did was raise the notion of richness versus scope, which was research that came before you and I, but we extrapolated what that meant for certain circumstances. And you've done the same thing with something called the Cynefin model, which is a really interesting starting point. And then we'll talk about what you've added to and extrapolated onto that. But first of all, tell us what that first model is, because first of all, it's in Welsh, and Welsh may as well be Greek, and there's too many consonants, and help me out.
Listen, you're the first. This is the first show I've been on where the host said it right. Cynefin, which is a model that was built by Dave Snowden and others. I certainly would give him full credit, and it's really meant as a model to help us make sense of the world. So if I put you someplace on the planet and tell you to leave, but if you don't have a map for leaving, you don't know where to go and you're stuck. And so as leaders, we find ourselves in a world, and sometimes we don't really know how to make sense of it because so we end up treating everything the same. So the Cynefin model says there's sort of four sort of domains in which a situation falls, and they all start with the letter C. And Wayne would laugh that Kevin likes alliteration, but this is not my model, Wayne. Just saying. So the four.
But we know why it appeals to you.
Well, it's not the only reason. It's just an added bonus, as it turns out, Wayne. So the Cynefin model says that situations that we find ourselves in are either clear, the context is either clear, it's complicated, it's complex, or it's chaotic. And it relates to how much we know about, or what we know about in the situation. And from that, according to the great work of Snowden and others, is to say, well, given that context, what should we then, what is the best next step for us to take? And the problem is that as leaders, we have typically been trained to lead in situations, contexts that are clear. We know the information, there's an answer, we pick the answer, we've got best practices. I mean, listen, I worked in an organization before I started this company at Chevron, well-run, well-respected, good company, that in that time period over 30 years ago, the big focus was best practices. And if the world is clear, or relatively clear, and there are things we can figure out, then best practices are a great way to go. When the context is clear, that's great. Also, when the context is clear, it's really easy for leaders to say, I have the answer, let's go, everyone follow me, and let's go. but that's not the world we live in most of the time. And yet that's the place we end up spending where we think our time is. That's what leaders end up doing.
Well, and of course that leads to the idea of flexibility, right? The ability to lead when there's a distinct roadmap is very different when, it's March 17th of 2020 and the world blows up and we don't know what the heck we're doing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so what you've done is you've taken the Cynefin model and you have added these things called flexors. And these are designed to help a leader say, okay, this situation is really chaotic. Here are the things I need to think about versus there's the roadmap is clear. So help us through the flexors and what does that mean?
Yeah. So let's just take an example of one, right? So the idea of flexors are, so it's easy to say, well, understand what the situation is and then lead accordingly, except that that's not very helpful really yet. And so let's take an example. So for years, Wayne, I've asked leaders in groups, I said, would you rather lead for compliance or commitment? And nearly every leader will reason, I want to lead for commitment. I want my team to be committed and all that stuff. So there's a flexor, compliance and commitment, right? Okay. So I'd rather have my team be committed. That sounds awesome. And yet what do most of us find we've experienced? In fact, I can ask those same leaders next, where does your leader lead you? Do they lead you to being committed and engaged, or do they lead you to just, yes, boss, right? Straight up mere compliance is yes, sir, yes, ma'am, yes, boss, whatever you say, boss. And for the most part, we don't think that seems like that's what we want. We'd really have people rather be committed, right? Okay, cool. So does that mean that we should forget about compliance and just focus on commitment? I would say no. Listen, if the moment is truly chaotic and no one knows what's going on, let's take March 17th, 2020, right? What everybody needed was for the boss to say, we got to do something. What are we going to do? And in that moment, people were ready to comply. Like, there's nothing wrong with compliance in the right context. In that moment, like, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do this, and we're going to get computers to everybody, and here's what's going to happen. Okay, but staying there and continuing to lead or act in that place of chaos and stay in command and control, some people found that didn't work very long, just like they found in other situations it doesn't work very well, right? So maybe in the 1940s, or 1950s, when most everything was pretty well clear and all of the knowns were known, then people were more okay with sort of following what the boss said. And yet now that's not the way the world looks. It's not the way the world acts. There's more uncertainty. It's more complicated and complex, which means that back to the flexor itself, the right answer is seldom solely compliance or solely commitment, but somewhere in between. Now, I would say, and we talk about in the book, that in a world that's more complex or complicated, we're probably going to lean more toward the commitment side. Makes a great deal of sense. But sometimes people don't need to be committed; they just need to know where we're going. And that's the example of it could be directionally either way, and that's okay, right? People were fine with saying, hey, we're going to continue to do this, but now notice how many people haven't felt so good about the bosses of the world, simply people like us, simply saying we're going to bring you all back. Like, that hasn't worked so well because compliance alone isn't necessarily the best approach in this complex and complicated world we're in now.
Yeah, so we've got to be flexible. And how does that match up with being consistent and accountable? I mean, it sounds on the surface like there's a paradox there.
Oh, I think there definitely is a paradox there, right? And so we could put consistent and flexible as a flexor too. So here's the example that I use in the book, and it's, I think, the best one I've come up with to date. And that is, look at a tree. A tree that's, 10, 15, 20 years old. And you would likely look at that tree and say, that tree's stable. That tree's consistent. That tree's got longevity. That tree's solid. And it is. It's deeply rooted. And it's the roots that keep it solid. And yet a tree that isn't able to flex, if its branches aren't able to flex, not going to last very long. And so the tree is both consistent, stable, sturdy, and flexible. It's both of those things. So in all of these cases, when we think about a paradox, we need to stop thinking about, well, which one is it, but how much of each one is it, right? So if we go back to the tree, it's stable because it's rooted. So if we go back to say, do we want leaders to be consistent or do we want leaders to be flexible? I would say the answer, like a tree, is yes, both. A tree is stable and consistent because of its roots. A leader needs to be consistent in their roots, which is their values, their principles, the kinds of principles you've been talking about on the show, in their mission of their organization, in morality and ethics. Like, those are the things that we must be consistent on, but we must be flexible, as we've been talking about in the last 20 minutes or so, on approach. So the what and the why are consistent. The how is flexible.
Yeah, that idea of the how being where the flexibility comes in, I think, is really important. Talk to me about some communication challenges and then the strategies to deal with that. How is communication different in a flexible leader's approach than in one who is more firmly rooted?
I think the first thing is, as you decide that you have the intention of wanting to be flexible in approach, then that needs to be one of the things that your organization and your team knows, that they understand, hey, we know what we can expect of Kevin. And one of the things we're going to expect of Kevin is that he's going to adapt based on the situation as needed. And I'd like to hope our team would say that about me. But I think the first part about communicating about it is for people, we have to be clear about our intention around it. And then we can share that with others, just like you've talked for years about having clear expectations about how we communicate and when we communicate. This is just another example that is about the expectations of how we're going to interact relate to this idea of that we may have to be flexible. And you know what? That may mean that I'm going to need to respond in this situation in a way that's not my natural or first inclination. And I think that ends up being super healthy, but we have to, as you said, get people to understand this is how we lead.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. And I understand working with me will turn almost anybody into Gumby. I understand that it requires some flexibility and some patience. But aside from dealing with Wayne, which, I don't wish on anybody, but what have you found?
I took it on willingly, Wayne.
Well, I understand that. But what have you found in the last little while is a flexor that you've really had to exercise? Maybe something that you've had to be more flexible with than you ever thought that you might.
I think that I've had to be, I have to really work at one that is, I sometimes need to be firmer with folks than I think I sometimes am. I will lean toward letting people make their call, helping them decide what they want to do, when sometimes I need to be a little clearer about, hey, this is what we need to do. This is where we're going to focus. And so I've had to work on, anytime there's a situation that you're facing that you realize a better approach might not be your natural inclination, those are all the times when you're going to have to work at the flexing a bit more, right? Otherwise, if we just go to our first natural instinct, then we won't necessarily get we won't flex. We'll just keep doing what we've always done. We'll keep doing what the assessment we took says we are, because that's the kind of leader that I am, right? So whenever we're forced by the situation or the context to adjust if we want better results, those are the times. And that's an example. It's the first one that comes to my mind.
I think it's a perfectly good one. And knowing you as I do, I think that's probably the correct one. We're going to wrap it up on this. It's funny. In our business, we teach leadership and we teach organizations around the world. And for a while, everything was in-person workshops, and we were very focused on kind of new leaders, supervisors. And then all of a sudden, it was remote, and we were helping people do that with the books. And Long Distance Leader, you and I wrote that book in 2018, and 7 languages and thousands of copies later, we've helped some people through that. And now we're kind of being told remote is done and everything is kind of either office first or office mostly. As we wrap it up, how is flexible leadership the key to navigating whatever this next thing is?
I'll say 2 things. The first thing I want to say is I'm going to go back to what you and I said at the very beginning about long distance leader, which is if you got one person that's not in the office, you have a remote team. And that's going to, even if it's just the once in a whiles, right? Or I got to sick kids, like that's never going away ever again. The technology allows that. So people aren't going to have to take PTO for some of that, right? So, and we're going to allow that whether we like it or not. And I would say that that's probably a good thing for us to do that. That would be a flexible approach. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is if we want to, there's 2 important words in the subtitle of the book. So the book is Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. And so those seem paradoxical, oxymoronic as well, right? Like uncertainty and confidence. And to me, the confidence comes from knowing that if the situation is uncertain, which we know they are and will be, like I think we can be confident they will continue to be uncertain. So we build confidence in that by having a way to navigate. And the way we navigate is what we've talked about, having a way to make sense of the situation or find context, and then use flexors to help us adjust in that moment. And so to me, the confidence comes from having a playbook to deal with the uncertainty, not because that means the uncertainty goes away, but that we know that we have a way to work through it with our teams, not in spite of our teams, not for our teams, but with our teams.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. I just want to tell our listeners they can learn more about the book, including getting some really cool deals on bulk buys and discounts on major amounts of the book at kevineikenberry.com/flexible-leadership. I haven't said this to you, so I will say it now while everybody is listening. I think this book is a logical next step. I think it is the next step. Remote leadership, the teams, long distance leader, all of that good stuff was the what's happening and, what do we do? But how we do it and how we adjust and how we lead from this point forward is going to be far more critical, because now we know what we're up against. At least what we're up against this week.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I would like to think that this is something that, is not tied to a situation like where people are working or when they're working, but rather about, giving us a way to make sense of any context so that we can make better choices or more informed choices. And really it comes down to making either or choices, making both and choices, not either or choices. And I really do hope people will go to kevineikenberry.com/flexible-leadership, because as Wayne said, there's all sorts of ways to get all kinds of cool stuff. You buy multiple copies of the book, but you can get a single copy there. You can get a sample chapter there and and all sorts of other stuff. Hope you'll do that. Thanks for having me, Wayne.
As always, and I've been saying this for 10 years, thank you for being had. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Kevin Eikenberry. More on that in a moment. I am going to now share with you some news that I don't know how it's going to affect you, but it is going to affect you if you are listening to this show. For over 100 and some odd, and yes, some are odder than others, episodes, we have brought you the best information we can, whether it's Marissa and I sharing the conversations that people have about remote and hybrid work, talking to very, very smart people who are experts in the field and are making it work every day. And in many ways, we've kind of accomplished what we set out to do, which was help people make the transition to this new, very complex, complicated world that Kevin was talking about. And therefore, this is technically the last episode of the Long Distance Work Life. The website is going to be up for a long time, for the foreseeable future. Show notes to all the shows that we have put up in the past, show notes to this one, so you can get access to Kevin and links to the book and to flexible leadership. Going forward, new episodes of this show that we do kind of as good ideas occur to us will be rolled into the Remarkable Leadership podcast. If you are not listening to Kevin's podcast, get on it. But one of the things that we are going to do starting in February is I am doing a 6-part series called The Evolving Workplace. And we're going to start with the first episode. How did we get here? How did remote and hybrid work come to be a thing? Why is it so chaotic? We're going to talk about the different approaches that organizations can take, the technology and what that means. And then we're going to look very carefully at what do organizations need to consider as the workplace continues to evolve, what do leaders need to consider, and what do individuals need to know and think in order to, yes, thrive and survive in the always evolving workplace. So thank you for listening on behalf of Marissa and myself. We appreciate your listenership. We appreciate your active participation in the discussions and the shows and the show ideas. We hope that you will follow us over to the Remarkable Leadership podcast and understand that remote and hybrid work is now part of the overall leadership picture, as Kevin was talking about. So on behalf of Marissa and myself, thank you. We appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you down the road. Don't let the weasels get you down. Have a great week.